So here we are, January 19th. Now, this day may mean absolutely nothing to you because you're watching this on YouTube, but for some, specifically, I would say mostly the younger generation, today might be a little bit of a sad day. In fact, numbers may go up on other apps because today in the United States, TikTok is banned. Nope, just kidding. That is a complete falsehood. As it turns out, TikTok is, well, let's just say no longer banned, but my Elgato is. There we go. So as you can see here, statement from TikTok: in agreement with our service providers, TikTok is in the process of restoring service. We thank President Trump for providing the necessary clarity and assurance to our service providers that they will face no penalties providing TikTok to over 170 million Americans and allowing over 7 million small businesses to thrive. It is a strong stand for the First Amendment and against arbitrary censorship. We will work with President Trump on a long-term solution that keeps TikTok in the United States. Now, originally, this video was going to be different because I watched a video by the Legal Eagle that was kind of explaining the backstory behind what was going on with the kind of laws behind it, what happened, what Biden did, and what was going to happen with Trump moving forward. I'm still going to play all of those parts, but keep in mind, as I talk about it being shut down, it is now going back online. At the end of this video, if you stay tuned for that, I'm going to explain what my thoughts are on this and how exactly this happened. Now, I wanted to watch a video going over this from someone who is so much smarter than me. That's the Legal Eagle. He put out a video going over the illegal part of the TikTok ban, but I'm Canadian, so TikTok is not banned for me, and this is like hello. This is like very like head of the nail. Just if it'll let me play.
Hello?
Hey there.
Oh, hey! You Canadian?
Yep.
Yeah, me too.
Where'd everyone go?
I don't know. Everyone was here a minute ago.
This is weird, eh?
Hello?
This is weird, eh? Anyway, the entirety of TikTok is that I've seen is predominantly based in the US, and here's why. A lot of you may not know this. In Canada, from everything that I have seen, you cannot get paid for doing TikTok. That like profit sharing thing that they launched in the US doesn't exist. And I've talked to many creators who do Call of Duty on TikTok, and they made a good chunk of change from a decent amount of views. But as a Canadian, I couldn't get paid. So a lot of content creators in Canada just simply didn't do it, like myself, because of that fact. So I am very curious what the English speaking portion of TikTok is going to look like in a week from now. Now, is this going to get upheld? That's what I want to kind of watch this video for, to get a kind of sense in the coming weeks as Trump goes into office. Is he going to upheld this new law that has been put into place, and what exactly does it mean? So this one, there's going to be a lot of legal jargon. I will try to break it down for you guys. And if I can't, we'll look it up.
The Supreme Court refuses to stay the execution of the law that, effective January 19th, forces TikTok to be sold to a U.S. company or to shut down. You might have seen customers react to the U.S. government trying to ban TikTok over concerns that its Chinese parent company could exert too much control and provide information to the Chinese.
Spoiler alert. Every company that you have on your phone, whether it is a small mobile game company or whether it's Facebook, tracks everything. When you get that pop-up, like I have an iPhone, I used to have an Android. Really, I don't care. It's just like I got an iPhone because my whole family uses iPhones and you know, the blue talk. But I really don't care. I loved Android for years. But it doesn't matter. Whatever you're on, you'll get that pop-up. Are you okay with them tracking your activity? They track everything. If you want to be really creeped out, go on to whatever map software that you use, whether it's Google Maps, Apple Maps, whatever it is, and look at your history. It will tell you where you've been in like the last, I think it's months. Honestly, I think it's months. It'll tell you how long it took you to get there. It'll tell you how long you were there for. It tells you everything. This is not just a TikTok thing. They just use it to try to get at the Chinese, I think is what's going on.
By downloading a TikTok clone that is literally run by the Chinese government. How did we get here? Now, as you probably know, TikTok is a foreign-owned tech platform operating on American devices. Chinese technology company ByteDance launched the app in 2016. It now has over 1.5 billion active users, including about 150 million Americans. Now, many Americans make their living by making short films on the app, And TikTok's creators say that other social media platforms lack TikTok's
They say there's 1.5 billion and only 150 million are Americans. This says 170. That means that's 1%. Am I doing that right? Or is it 10%? Is it 1% or 10?
organic reach
Pulling up a
and
calculator.
collaboration tools. Some have said, quote,
should be able to
they
do
have
that in my
posted the
head.
same content on other platforms for years, but only TikTok has fostered their communities and allowed them to reach broad audiences. Now, the people who serve in Congress generally don't grow up with social media platforms. The average age of a senator is 64, and the average age of a House member is 58. And that might be one reason members of Congress struggle with the implications of modern technology, which obviously is global. But for better or worse, the government is responsible for protecting the country from foreign threats, but it also has a duty to
10%.
ensure
It is
Americans
10%.
have civil liberties.
Brain.
Now, the courts traditionally defer to the federal government in matters of national security. And along those lines, on April 24th, 2024, Congress enacted the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. The law prohibits the distribution, maintenance, or provision of...
So here's what this real question comes down to. If I was an American, and I'm not, but if I was an American, the question I would be asking here is, why are you passing a law directly about one company and not about data collection as a whole? That's not a law that is against one company.
Of internet hosting services for applications controlled by foreign adversaries.
Like, put it this way. It's as if you were upset about, I'm trying to pick something random, about the way factory farming is done for chickens. And it's like there's just too many chickens on one property, or whatever the problem may actually be. But you only sued McDonald's for its chicken. It doesn't make any sense.
The act identifies China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran as foreign adversaries of the United States who are not eligible to purchase apps. The law officially bars Americans from using apps controlled by those countries. And the law requires ByteDance specifically to sell TikTok to remove, quote, foreign adversary control. And failure to comply results in a ban within 270 to 300.
Which honestly shows you how goddamn big TikTok is, that the US was just like, you can sell your company to an American investor, or you can just not be here anymore. And they're like, all right, bye.
60 days. Now, the Supreme Court generally considers laws targeting specific speech as presumptively unconstitutional. In 2020, Donald Trump issued 2 executive orders banning TikTok, but the federal courts blocked both of those. So many legal commentators felt the new law was also on shaky ground. So when this new law was passed, TikTok and a group of its users sued the government, once again arguing that the act is an unconstitutional intrusion on free speech rights. Quote, by banning all online platforms and software applications offered by TikTok and all ByteDance subsidiaries, Congress has made a law curtailing massive amounts of protected speech. Unlike broadcast television and radio stations, which require government licenses to operate because they use the public airwaves, the government cannot, consistent with the First Amendment, dictate the ownership of newspapers, websites, online platforms, and other privately created speech forums.
Okay.
Now, TikTok claimed that it's an American company headquartered in Culver City, California, which means it has First Amendment rights. Thus, TikTok alleged that courts should apply a legal standard called strict scrutiny. Now, when it comes to reviewing government regulation, what level of scrutiny the court applies is usually the entire ballgame. When a court applies strict scrutiny, the government must show that the law is the least restrictive means of advancing a compelling governmental interest. And that is a very, very hard standard to meet. Strict scrutiny applies when a law regulates fundamental rights like freedom.
So when they put the governmental interests over the general public, or they say that the general public interests are actually governmental interests, I guess.
Speech. Now, normally when courts are reviewing governmental regulation, if it doesn't involve a fundamental right, the courts apply what's called rational basis review, which basically means if the court can find any rational basis for a particular law, it will uphold that law. Basically, any law that's reviewed under rational basis review is going to be upheld, and basically any law that's reviewed under strict scrutiny is not going to pass muster and then will be found to be not constitutional.
Okay.
And then there's a third option that's sort of a combination of the two. It's sort of right down the middle. It's called intermediate scrutiny. That's used when laws involve a right, but one that's not fundamental. Now, the US government argued that the act doesn't implicate the First Amendment at all. The government rejected plaintiffs' assertion that TikTok is a US company entitled to free speech rights because it's a subsidiary of ByteDance. And ByteDance, as a foreign company, does not receive free speech rights.
So when they're talking about this free speech, of course, being what they're talking about, basically they're saying this doesn't interrupt free speech because you can still say whatever you want. They get to choose where you say it on.
But what about TikTok's American users? Well, the government claimed that the act doesn't regulate their speech at all. Americans remain free to say whatever they want on other platforms,
Yeah.
and in fact, they would continue to be free to say whatever they wanted in a post-divestiture version of TikTok. The government argued that the court should use the rational basis test, which is the lowest level of review, and not surprisingly, the government argued for rational basis review. And as we talked about, the standard there is that the government's actions have to be rationally related to a legitimate government interest. That is an extremely, extremely low bar. The government can usually come up with a rational reason, meaning basically any reason whatsoever that is related to a legitimate government interest, meaning basically any governmental interest at all. All the government has to do is show that there's a hypothetical connection between the interest and the statute's goals. So this litigation went up on appeal. In TikTok versus Garland, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia upheld the constitutionality of the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. Now, the first question for the court was what standard of review to apply. And the court said, quote, "We conclude that the act implicates the First Amendment and is subject to heightened scrutiny. Whether strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny applies is a closer question. The relevant portions of the act are facially content neutral, but the government
So they had to put it under stricter scrutiny than just
arguably
the
based its
easy one.
content manipulation justification for the act upon the content on the platform. We think it only prudent, therefore, to assume without deciding that the higher standard applied." Now, side note, what does a court mean when it says it assumes without deciding that a certain standard applies? Well, the court is declining to rule as a matter of law that a particular standard applies, usually because the outcome of a case would be the same regardless of which standard the court used.
Oh, okay.
And in something that
That's not
basically
what I thought,
never
but-
happens, the Court of Appeals ruled that the government could clear the high bar set by strict scrutiny. Part one of the test is whether the government has a compelling interest. And the Court of Appeals said, quote, "The government offered two national security justifications.
Okay.
One, to counter the PRC's efforts to collect great quantities of data about tens of millions of Americans, and two, to limit the PRC's ability to manipulate content covertly on the TikTok platform."
So basically, what the American government is saying by this is that it is okay if the American government takes all your data, but no other government should, which somewhat makes sense and somewhat doesn't at all, because they're like, okay, we don't want foreign intelligence to use your data against our country, but we can use it against you. That's fine.
The former does not reference the content of speech or reflect disagreement with an idea or message. The court agreed with the government that China posed a, quote, hybrid commercial threat because it had adopted laws that enable it to access and use data held by Chinese companies. Now, does the US have any evidence that China has leveraged these relationships to access American data? Well, it's classified, apparently.
Okay. What?
Now, all this was appealed to the Supreme Court, and in the government's brief
Weird.
there, Attorney
Editor
General Merrick
issue?
Garland said Congress has received classified security briefings about TikTok. Theoretically, a court could have ordered the government to produce evidence from these briefings in an in-camera review, meaning a secret review, which would ensure the information was kept secret, but so far no court has asked the government to provide evidence of those briefings. So the national security threats are hypothetical. The government predicts that if the Chinese government asked TikTok to, quote, manipulate content for censorship, propaganda, or other malign purposes, TikTok would try to comply with that order. But TikTok asserted that the government's concerns about data collection were made in bad faith. America is the only member of the G7 without a federal data privacy legislation or unified approach to data governance. TikTok and many other apps collect large swaths of data about its users,
All of
including
them?
device information, IP address, keystroke patterns, activity across devices, browsing and search history, etc., and location data. Now, this is my opinion, but if data collection is a national security threat, then maybe Congress should pass a data privacy
Hey,
law
that's what I
stopping
said. That's what I said.
Twitter and Facebook from collecting the same data as TikTok. You know, just a thought. But the Court of Appeals saw things differently. Quote, that the act does not fully solve the data collection threat posed by the PRC does not mean it was not a step in the right direction. And the court quoted liberally from the government's brief, stating, quote, as Assistant Director of National Intelligence, Casey Blackburn explained, the PRC is the most active and persistent cyber espionage threat to the US government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. Its hacking program spans the globe and is larger than that of every other major nation combined. The PRC has pre-positioned itself for potential cyber attacks against US critical infrastructure by building out offensive weapons within that infrastructure. Consistent with that assessment, the government has found persistent PRC access in US critical telecommunications, energy, water, and other infrastructure. And the court noted that a bipartisan group of legislators concluded that China tracked
Just wanted to throw this up there. This is what happens when my Elgato breaks. But it says, sorry, TikTok isn't available right now. A law banning TikTok has been enacted in the US. Unfortunately, that means you cannot use TikTok for now. We are fortunate that President Trump has indicated that he will work with us on a solution to reinstate TikTok once he takes office. Please stay tuned. We'll I'm assuming come to that at some point in this video, but
user data.
Interesting,
Quote,
nonetheless.
Of particular relevance to the government's first justification for the act, the PRC has engaged in extensive and years-long efforts to accumulate structured data sets, in particular on U.S. persons to support its intelligence and counterintelligence operations. So the court found that the government's two national security justifications were compelling state interests. And it's not surprising that the court deferred to the federal government's judgment about the severity of the national security threats. However, that's only the first part of the strict scrutiny test analysis.
Okay,
In
what's
part two
number
of the
two?
test, the government has to show that the law is narrowly tailored to that interest or that it's the least speech restrictive means available to the government. But TikTok proposed a number of less speech restrictive options that they argued could have satisfied
I didn't
the
know this
government's
part.
goals without burdening speech. Quote, these include disclosure or reporting requirements, the government using speech of its own to counter any alleged foreign propaganda, limiting TikTok's collection of location and contact data, and extending the ban of TikTok.
So basically, TikTok said, we'll limit the things that you were allowed to take off of people in the US. Like, that's fine. They're like, we'll do that. And the US was just like, no, not good enough?
TikTok on government devices to government employees' personal devices. But the court rejected these options, instead agreeing with the government that data collection and content manipulation are not the type of harm that can be remediated by disclosure.
Why is my God
Traditionally,
keep
the
doing that?
remedy for speech we disagree with is more speech. That's a foundational aspect of the First Amendment. But here, the court rejects this principle entirely. Quote, the idea that the government can simply use speech of its own to counter the risk of content manipulation by the PRC is likewise naive. The court said, quote, the petitioner's attempt to frame the use of government speech as a means of countering alleged foreign propaganda is beside the point. It is the secret manipulation of the content on TikTok, not foreign propaganda, that poses a grave threat to national security. No amount of government...
Wait. Framing the use of government speech as means of countering alleged foreign let me re-listen to that part.
manipulation of the content on TikTok
I did.
are not the type of harm that can be remediated by disclosure. Traditionally, the remedy for speech we disagree with is more speech. That's a foundational aspect of the First Amendment. But here, the court rejects this principle entirely. Quote, the idea that the government can simply use speech of its own to counter the risk of content manipulation by the PRC is likewise naive. The court said, quote, the petitioner's attempt to frame the use of government speech as a means of countering alleged foreign propaganda is beside the point. It is the secret manipulation of the content on TikTok, not foreign propaganda, that poses a grave threat to national security. No amount of government speech can mitigate that threat nearly as effectively as divestiture.
What they're basically saying is people aren't free to think for themselves. They're going to see these things online and believe them and not believe what the government is saying. That's what that says. And sheesh. I wouldn't tell people that.
The court also dismissed the TikTok creator's argument that the government could achieve its goals by banning TikTok from collecting the data. Quote, the data collection risks identified by the government include the PRC's ability to use TikTok for bulk collection of data and for targeted collection on individuals. But frankly, it's possible that the court is the one that misunderstands the bulk collection risks, not the TikTok creators. Lots of websites and social media platforms collect the same information about its users, and sometimes more. Again, the US does not have a comprehensive data privacy law, and the court says that the government can't monitor what TikTok does, so it would have no way of knowing whether the app complied with the data collection regulations.
Okay.
As a result, the court says the only option that would meet the government's goals is full divestiture. But frankly, divestiture wouldn't even stop the data collection practices either. Say, for example, that ByteDance did sell the app to somebody else.
This is
That
huge.
app is still free under American law to collect all that information and sell it. That means the law is wildly under-inclusive. And the law doesn't even apply to American companies like Facebook, which arguably has worse data collection and privacy practices than
anyone.
TikTok does.
No,
and
not
TikTok
just
also
TikTok,
argued the
but
law
anyone.
is over-inclusive, which means it includes more people and entities than it needs to achieve the law's purpose. The act applies to, quote, another ByteDance product, CapCut, that can be used to edit videos on various platforms, including TikTok, but does not collect user data or present an opportunity for PRC manipulation of content. But the Court of Appeals concluded that everything related to ByteDance is theoretically just as harmful as TikTok. And as for TikTok's free speech argument, the court said that the government is actually furthering free speech rather than hindering it. A foreign government threatens to distort free speech on an important medium of communication. Using its hybrid commercial strategy, the PRC has positioned itself to manipulate public discourse on TikTok in order to serve its own ends. The PRC's ability to do so is at odds with free speech fundamentals. Indeed, the First Amendment precludes a domestic government from exercising comparable control over a social media company in the United States. Here, the Congress, as the executive proposed, acted to end the PRC's ability to control.
So just to be clear, Basically, they're saying the app will manipulate people's content and not allow free speech. But the American companies that collect all your data are taking money from political campaigns and sending that out to people. That isn't doing the exact same thing. Just to be clear, it's not
understood in that way. The act
same.
actually vindicates the values that undergird the First Amendment. But I guess at least the court acknowledged that the act frequently referred to the content of TikTok speech. Quote, in fact, the government identifies a particular topic, Taiwan's relationship to the PRC, as a significant potential flashpoint that may be a subject of the PRC's influence operations, and its declarants identify other topics of importance to the PRC. And yet the court agreed with the government that, quote, the act is not an effort to control the flow of ideas to the public. But TikTok lost in the Court of Appeals and then appealed to the Supreme Court. The justices agreed to fast-track the briefing and held arguments on January 10th, 9 days before the law was set to go into effect. See, when the Supreme Court wants to fast-track something like a private business interest, they can. But it's good that they took 2 years to decide US versus Trump, because that obviously wasn't as important as a dance app. Now, obviously, if you're operating a social media network, you'll want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've gotten in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you got one of those data breach letters saying your information might have been leaked, or are dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. Because it's so important to talk to a lawyer right away so you can maximize your recovery. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front.
I feel like most lawyers
link in
work
the
by
description
that.
or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team. And now the Supreme Court has upheld the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, clearing the way for TikTok to be banned in the US on Sunday. The court ruled that the US government has a compelling interest in protecting sensitive user data from potential misuse by foreign adversaries, particularly the Chinese government. TikTok apparently poses a significant risk to American citizens because of ByteDance's ties to China, which could enable unauthorized access to personal data of US users. The Supreme Court ruled, quote, there's no doubt that for more than 170 million Americans, TikTok offers a distinctive and expansive outlet for expression, means of engagement, and source of community. But Congress has determined that divestiture is necessary to address its well-supported national security concerns regarding TikTok's data collection practices in relationship with a foreign adversary. For the foregoing reasons, we conclude that the challenge provisions do not violate petitioners' First Amendment rights. Now, the first takeaway from this opinion is that the court found that the act was a content-neutral restriction. A restriction is content-based if it regulates speech because of the subject matter, idea, or message being conveyed.
Okay.
Several U.S. lawmakers expressed concerns about Chinese propaganda when they drafted the act. However, the court did not consider evidence suggesting that the act targeted certain viewpoints. Quote, we are especially wary of parsing Congress's motives on this record with regard to an act passed with striking bipartisan support. Now, bipartisan legislation is rare, but that doesn't say anything about whether something is constitutional or not. Now, the court ruled that the government, quote, had a content-neutral justification for the act, quote, preventing China from collecting vast amounts of sensitive data from 170 million US TikTok users.
Okay, so it's
now,
170
content-neutral
million
laws
now.
are generally subject to intermediate scrutiny, which, as we discussed, is less rigorous than strict scrutiny. And just like the DC Circuit, the Supreme Court, quote, assumed without deciding that the challenge provisions fall within this category and are subject to First
One thing
Amendment
that I
scrutiny.
didn't say before is I do wonder. So we were saying that that's 10% of the users on the app. Is it 10 or 1? It's anyway, I think it's 10% of the users on the app. I wonder what percentage of creators are in that 170 million. Because of course, I bet you there's more American creators than probably any other country. And just because like things to make content is more readily available. And I wonder how this affects TikTok.
So they engage in a First Amendment analysis, just not strict scrutiny because they claim it's content neutral. Now, the second takeaway from the court's opinion is that the act apparently balanced the government's national security interest with petitioners' First Amendment rights. Quote, the act's prohibitions and divestiture requirements are designed to prevent China, a designated foreign adversary, from leveraging its control over ByteDance Limited to capture the personal data of US TikTok users. This objective qualifies as an important government interest under intermediate scrutiny. Now, how does the act protect the First Amendment rights of the petitioners, including TikTok and Americans who use the app? Well, as to the company's rights, it doesn't impose an outright ban, meaning the company can still operate in the US if it satisfies the conditional divestiture requirement, meaning its parent company has to divest. And as for TikTok
sell it
users,
to an American.
the act does not prevent users from expressing their ideas through other platforms or means. It targets the operational structure of TikTok, not the ability of users to create and share content. And if TikTok is no longer available, users can post the same content to other platforms.
YouTube
I am not saying
Shorts.
I agree with it. I'm saying that's what the court's rationale was. The Supreme Court took the government's security rationale seriously, apparently more seriously than President Biden or incoming President Trump, which we will discuss. The court deferred to Congress's determination that the threat was real. Quote, sound policymaking often requires legislators to forecast future events and to anticipate the likely impact of these events based on deductions and inferences for which complete empirical support may be unavailable. And here, apparently, the government's TikTok-related data collection concerns do not exist in isolation. The record reflected that China, quote, has engaged in extensive and years-long efforts to accumulate structured data sets, in particular on U.S. persons, to support its intelligence and counterintelligence operations. And the court believed Congress when it said China is gathering information on U.S. users for nefarious purposes. The government cited Chinese law, which compels companies to turn over information if China demands it, as proof that TikTok posed serious dangers. Now, other applications also hoover up large swaths of American user data, but the court said this case should not be interpreted as limiting what those apps can do with your data. Quote, while we find that differential treatment was justified here, however, we emphasize the inherent narrowness of our holding. Data collection and analysis is a common practice in this digital age, but TikTok's scale and susceptibility to foreign adversary control, together with the vast swaths of sensitive data the platform collects, justify differential treatment.
So, like, what's crazy to me is they're legitimately 100% saying, if this was an American company, we don't care. We'll let them, as long as we have control of your data.
Now, the government made bold claims about the Chinese government's ability to control messages on the app by manipulating the TikTok algorithm. But the Supreme Court sidestepped that issue. Quote, the record before us adequately supports the conclusion that Congress would have passed the challenge provisions based on the data collection justification alone.
Yeah, okay.
So that's it. The law goes into effect. But what happens now? Well, President Biden has the power to grant extensions under the act if certain requirements are met, but instead Biden has just announced that he will just not enforce the law, which is cool. I didn't know a president could do that, you know, because of the whole take care clause of the Constitution, which requires the president to faithfully execute the laws of this country. But President Hot Dog Man, who signed the bill into law, says that he will not impose any fines on TikTok during the last few days of his presidency and will just let incoming President Trump deal with it. So that's fun. Which is odd because the entire rationale for the law is that this is about dire national security concerns. Now, Trump has indicated that he will also sign an executive order that also refuses to enforce this law. But again,
what does that even mean? So he's going to get into office and he's going to sign an executive order not to enforce a law. But
generally speaking, the president doesn't have the authority to just not enforce valid laws that have been passed. But like, you know, whatever. What even are laws? Like many of you, I probably spend way too much time on TikTok, time that I'd rather spend learning new things and getting the same gratification that I get while swiping through videos. Which is why even before the TikTok ban, I've been using an app that actually improves my understanding of practical human psychology, economics, philosophy, and history, which are topics that I'm actually...
So would he not have to sign an executive order to overturn the law? Because so basically what's happening here is they can't just like shut down TikTok. Like that's not the way it works. So what they have done is not allowed like IPs and like the things along those lines to support it, because then they are open to lawsuits. So if he signs into an executive order that he is not going to enforce it, it's up to these individual companies whether or not they will enforce it or not, with the worry of eventually getting sued or in huge trouble over this. And I just don't see... I don't know what happens at that point.
Deeply passionate about. The app is called Imprint, and they were kind enough to sponsor us without knowing they'd be attached to a video about the end of TikTok, an app they specifically designed their software to be a meaningful alternative to. It comes as no surprise to me that Google awarded Imprint the prestigious title of App of the Year, and Apple named it an essential education app. That's because Imprint changes your habits around learning. Imprint breaks down complex topics into interactive bite-sized chunks that are highly visual and designed to give you the same feeling of satisfaction you would get when scrolling through TikTok or Instagram. But unlike mindlessly scrolling through TikTok, spending time on Imprint will actually build your mind through engaging visual lessons. I'm currently working my way through interpersonal dynamics, the psychology of human relationships, as well as essential philosophy, theories, and tinkers. And I think I'll do the Read People Like a Book course next. And the best part is Imprint is designed to make you feel good about what you're learning. So whenever I have a few minutes of downtime in the day, I now feel compelled to load up Imprint instead of feeding my old doom scrolling habit. So right now you can click on the link that's on screen or down below in the description to get an exclusive offer to save 20% off the annual membership. And you don't have to commit right away because you can also use this link for a free 7-day trial. So click on the link or scan the code to start your free 7-day trial and get 20% off your annual subscription. And once you've done that, click on the link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.
All right, so my opinion on this, I think it's dumb. Like, if you're gonna pass a law like this, pass a law that covers all of the companies, including American ones, as to what data they can collect. I think it's like, I get why they like don't want China to have that data, but at the same time, like, shouldn't you care enough about the American people to not let any company have that data? Anyway, that's my thought on that. But do I see this being upheld? Probably not. But it's more, if the president says he's not going to support it, like, what about the other, like, what about like these other companies, like the FTC, and like, are they going to support it? Like, that's the part I don't understand. If the president comes in and says, I'm signing this executive order, I'm not supporting this, is it just like fair game? Okay, everyone, like, what if he was just like signed an executive order that's like, we're not going to prosecute murder? This is just okay to murder people then? Like, I don't understand how that part works. I wish he would have went into that a little bit more. But it literally, legitimately sounds like he had no idea. He's like, well, if the president says he's not going to support a law, is it a law? Like, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. But so I want to be clear as far as what's next. It appears as though TikTok is going to be here to stay. Now, seemingly what has happened is behind the scenes, Trump has made some sort of agreement with TikTok. Now, whether that is, like we talked about in that video, kind of limiting the amount of data that they can actually track, or whether this is some sort of sale to an American party, or whether this is just quite literally a payoff to Donald Trump, because keep in mind, he's not in office yet. So technically they could have paid him a lump sum of money right now. That's tinfoil hat. That's what this is for. This is what the tinfoil hat is for, is because it seems super odd that this happened right before he goes into presidency. He's about to be the new president, and now he's found out an agreement for this before he's even in office. Now, he did say before this that he wasn't going to support this and not going to legally withhold this. But the curious part is this is still a law. This is a law that was passed. So what he does with this moving forward, we don't know. But for those people who make TikToks out there, for those of you who like TikTok, it is back online. It is not gone. It is not banned. But it was briefly. Who knows what's going to happen next? Very, very odd situation we're living in these days. But here we are nonetheless. Go do your TikTok things.